Today's session is all about API testing, which is beyond the basics. We're going to be talking about some AI and automation techniques. We'll be showing some really interesting features that I hope that you guys will all be intrigued from. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Pooja Mistry. I am a developer advocate here, and I'm so excited to be doing this last Intergalactic of 2023 with my dear colleague, Joyce. Joyce, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Joyce. I am based in San Francisco and I also work in developer relations. I've been with Postman almost 7 years. And over the years, I think we've had educational sessions around testing, but this one has a lot of the new stuff. So even for folks that have been around for a while, who just got some really interesting things about AI, and we're just going to be talking about some of the newer features.
Yeah, definitely. So this is going to be an exciting session for everybody because if you haven't been following a lot of the things that are going on in Postman, we have done a lot in the AI space as well. So I'm excited to share with you all. So by the end of this session, what we hope that you get out of is that you kind of have an understanding of our automation capabilities, which, Postman is definitely known for the ability to automate test cases. And then we wanted to show you how you can amplify your scripting using a brand new feature called Postbot, which is a AI-powered assistant that basically interprets natural language into test cases, and you can do data visualization and data analysis, and then essentially kind of get a lot more proficiency when it comes to testing and building out API workflows. So by the end of the session, we want to focus on automation, testing, and Postbot as a tool to kind of guide you through that process. So today's agenda, we're going to learn basically what is testing in Postman. So for those of you who are new to Postman and have definitely used Postman to just, hit your first API request, you kind of understand what it looks like to get some API output from that. But we wanted to show you how you can go about testing, get a understanding of automation with Postbot, with Postman, and then also see how Postbot can be used as a tool to guide you with that testing. So we have two great demos that we're going to show today, one on Postbot, one on automation, and then feel free, we're going to share some resources, and feel free to ask your questions because we have a great team of moderators that are here to help answer any questions, great team of Postmanauts to share some of resources there. So with that, before we dive right in, we wanted to kind of get a little bit more insight about who you all are. So it sounds like you all joined this session because you were maybe interested in testing, maybe interested in AI, but I wanted to launch this poll to kind of get a little bit of insight in what kind of tests that you run. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll, and I'd love to kind of get some insight into everybody's idea of what kind of tests that they're able to run through Postman, what they've done, whether that's manual testing, exploratory testing. It looks like people are mostly working on like the functional API testing, end-to-end testing. So us at Postman, we're always interested to see how users use the product, and specifically testing has become a big bread and butter aspect of the product as well. So from what I see, it looks like a lot of people are doing a lot of their functional testing and have specifically also used Postman specifically for their manual testing aspects as well. So this is really interesting. So we have about 70 people that have participated, and I'm going to go ahead and see if I can share these results and share that poll with you all. So It looks like we have about 80% of you that have mainly used Postman for manual testing. We have a lot of you that have used Postman for API functional testing, end-to-end testing. So it's great to see that variety of testers. And for those manual testers out there, I hope that today's session kind of gives you a deeper insight on how you can write scripts and use Postbot specifically to help you do that. So let me go ahead and stop sharing that poll and we can get started. So
75% of you participated, so we didn't have an answer therefore. I've never tested in Postman. I'm curious if the 25% have never tested or there's just, they're doing something totally different. So feel free to share in the chat your use case. Interesting. Definitely. Some sophisticated users in here.
Definitely. All right, Joyce. So do you want to kind of talk about testing?
Yeah. Sure, yeah. So the reason why we ask those kind of questions in the poll is because a lot of times when people say they're testing APIs in Postman, what they really mean is that they're exploring an API, exploring the edges of an API, using the API client, updating parameters, making sure that they get back the status codes that they expect, making sure they get back the response that they expect. And that's another, that's another, some of you call it exploratory testing, some of you call it manual testing. And so the point of this session today is to get you a little higher up this pyramid. We won't go over the very specifics of writing a test because Pooja is going to show us a shortcut. But once you know how to actually write a test in Postman, you can create the most complex scenarios to address any types of testing that you might have seen on the poll. You can create rich test suites, automate that. And then even with automation and integration testing, there's going to be a use case where you have to go back to manual or exploratory testing. The automated tests reveal something that you didn't quite expect. So now you're going back and forth with manual and automated testing. And some of that's going to go hand in hand, but some people never move beyond the manual testing phase. And so this is the session where we're going to try to level you up and give you the tools that you need to move up the pyramid to wherever you choose to hang out.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great way to put it, Joyce. And I feel like people are definitely, if you aren't familiar with testing, this is a piece of the UI that people might be familiar with, but I'd love for you to share some more insight here as well.
Yeah, so we're not going to go in the specifics because, again, we have other sessions that are more geared towards testing 101, the basics. But in Postman, the interface, if you've never seen it before, on the request builder at the top, you have a tests tab where you can write a Postman test. In the highlighted section there is the syntax for a Postman test. It's JavaScript using BDD Chai.js assertions. And then when you run the request, the tests also run, and you're asserting the response is a certain way, and you can have the test results on the bottom. So that's a test and the test results at its very basics, but we will not be going over that in depth in this session.
Cool.
And as I mentioned, once you know the basics, that was the most baby test. You could have inserted a snippet to create your first test. There's all sorts of testing that you can do. You answered some of these questions in the poll that Pooja pulled earlier, but there's manual test, unit test, integration test, performance tests, relatively new. And again, if you haven't been paying attention to these types of testing in Postman lately, we're going to go over all that today.
Awesome. Yeah, for sure. And I'm actually really excited for all of the manual testers that are joining our call because I'm hoping that the next feature that we'll be talking about, which is Postbot, is something that'll empower them and give them a little bit more edge into their whole testing process. So I wanted to introduce to you all one of the newest features that have come out in 2023, which is Postbot, which is Postman's new AI assistant. So Postbot is used to write tests. You can visualize response. You can write FQL, which is flow query language in the Postman flows feature. And you can also use Postbot to write your documentation. So this is a really interesting feature because it's a tool that basically empowers users to, I like to see it as a template for testing, especially for testers when it comes to multiple APIs. The things that we care about are how to validate that we're getting the right data back. And so Postbot is one of those tools that really does that really easily. As well. So I'm going to go ahead and show you a demo of how we can use Postbot, and we can kind of take a look at some different queries and different ways that we can kind of test and build some queries. So with that, I wanted to share this Intergalactic link. So if we can have our moderators add that link into the chat. So basically, I have this blog that I wanted to share with you all, which is all about introducing Postbot, our new assistant. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more of the product itself, feel free to take a look there. And I know that some of you are asking some questions in the main chat, so feel free to direct those questions into the Q&A button, and we have some moderators that are definitely willing to answer and help you out there. So with that, I'm in my Postman Intergalactic workspace, and I have a collection here called Postbot Testing. So this is a collection that we're going to kind of work through. There's a lot of different requests in here, and feel free if you are taking a look at Postman Intergalactic, you can go ahead and fork this request into your own workspace and kind of follow along or play around with it as well. So with Postbot, I wanted to kind of show you different ways to kind of work with it. So in our first request, I have this API, which is basically my library API. And I'm getting some data based on my books that are available in my library. So for example, my genres, year published, I get my status code back. So this is a good GET request API. So with Postbot, I can kind of use that to write tests. So for those of you who are not familiar with testing in Postman, you can go to the test tab. And, of course, before we had all of our snippets that we can use to test our API, such as test our status code, test our body, but we have this banner right here which says write scripts with Postbot, and we also have it here at the bottom, which allows us to write some tests with this tool. So in this case, like if we're going to write some tests, we can either take a look at like the prompt and kind of add tests to this request, and you can see that will automatically add some tests to this request. So it added tests to check for status code, required fields, and their data types. So you can see that it's adding these tests, pm.test, response is 200, and you can see that it is checking for specific fields. For it to include those fields, you can see that it is testing for this year published. So here I already have a template of tests that is testing a lot of different elements of this API, and I can take a look at some of my test results as well. So with Postbot, I have already the fields that I wanted to add. I can always add more tests to it, which will add more tests along with it. And you can see that there are tests that are passing, there's tests that it's failing, and you can take a look at some of these tests that have been added automatically with Postbot, which is kind of cool right away. So here I have another request here, and I actually want to test for one of the books has the genre fiction. So I can write a test in here where I am testing that I want to validate like that one book in my output has a genre that is fiction, So here you can see that I'm using natural language, and I am seeing that Postbot is creating that test for me. So at least one book in the output that has a genre that is fiction. So you can see that it's returning, it's going through the JSON data, and it is finding a variable that fiction exists, and it's returning that to lowercase, which is this fiction, that the genre for one of the books in my output is equal to fiction. So you can see that you can also work and write natural language to do your testing within Postman as well. So that's pretty cool as well. So overall, we have a lot of different ways that you can kind of use Postbot in that sense. So here I have a post request. So I can, save these responses, and I can, use test my post request, and you can see that there are, with post requests, this response, it's expecting it to have status 200. So when we save that, you should be able to see that when we send that request, that is a failing test. So when you fix that test, it should be able to update that validation of that status as 201. So Postbot is pretty intuitive in the way where it understands what kind of outputs you're getting from your tests, and it allows you to automatically fix tests and add more tests as you go forward. So you can see that that test was automatically able to be fixed using that scripting tool as well. And I have another example where if I have a, if I want to get, let's say I want to get the specific ID, and I want to save that ID in a variable to use in another request later. Let's like go through that example. So in this case, if you want to create a test, so like in this case, let's say I want to test for an ID, but for the first book, and then set that ID as a collection variable. So let me write that. So write a test to test ID, and then set the ID for the first book as a collection variable. And just so you know, collection variables are variables that, encompass your collection. You can also have environment variables, global variables, if you want to work more on a workspace level, or if you want to share your variables with your team. So in this case, we should see that, that it's doing a test for each book to have an ID, but then it's also setting using PM collection variables.set, which is first book ID. So it's getting this ID, and it should be setting that as a collection variable. So we can see that that test has passed. And now, if we take a look at our collection variable, you can see that variable was set and that ID was set as well based on that. So you might be wondering, why would you be interested in getting a variable? So I have a specific request after that. So for example, this is a request where I am getting a book by an ID, and its value is that value that I had set in my previous request, first book ID. So now if I send this, you can see that I can request that that book specifically by a variable that I had called in a previous test. So this is very helpful, especially if you want to build workflows, and if you want to, build like sequential sort of testing where you have, let's say you have one request that is getting you an access token, and you want to create another text that validates that that access token was created. So you can kind of get pretty creative with that as well. So it looks like we have a lot of different questions as well. And I think some of the folks have asked some questions about calling variables from one collection to another. So you can definitely do a lot more variable work with that. So in this case, I am going to use Postbot to validate that my ID is equal to that variable. So in this case, it would be first, let's see what I had called it. So first book ID. And it should be able to write me a test that validates that validates my output. So here you can see that this is a failing test. If we fix that test, maybe it might not work, but it gives you a comment right here exactly what to replace that. So we can replace this 1, 2, 3 here with our collection variable to validate that that test as well. So this is pretty interesting. You can get really creative with how you choose to test. You can also test the schema. So test the schema for this request. Let's see, conversion not found. So let's try again. So I can add this test for a schema. So let's see. It usually works for the most part. But well, we should try that. So and you should be able to see that there are certain schemas that you can write. I played around with this where you can test against a TV4 schema, where you can like see what the schema output looks like. You have to play around with it a little bit, but for the most part, you should be able to kind of create some sort of like schema driven test where you can, you can see that this test is showing that a schema is valid, where you can test for like specific titles and authors, and it's, testing that it is expecting some sort of TV4 schema. So you can definitely play around with this. I know that maybe this type of testing results, you probably have to have a better idea of how contract testing works to kind of understand some schema driven testing. But Postman is actually really, Postbot is actually really useful in schema driven testing as well. And then one of my favorite use cases for Postbot is actually visualizing this response. So if I visualize this response, I can visualize it as a table, which is really interesting. So you can see that it is setting a template for all of my fields, such as title and author and genre, and it's using the Postman visualizer to construct that template. So when I send this request, you can see that this data is now visualized into an entire table. And I've played around with this where I can create a table for books published in 2023. You can create lots of different types of tables where you can get really specific on the data. And we have actually a really interesting blog that I can show you what people have used the visualizer to create. And so I have another example for a visualization here where I can visualize the response as a line graph. And you can see that it requires you to generate the response. And then you can see that the visualization is being created where it is creating a visualizer for the high and the low values. And I kind of like doing, like changing it, like turn high values into green. And it should, change that line if that's something I'm interested in doing. accordingly. So you can see that Postbot is pretty intuitive in terms of visualization as well. One other really interesting thing about Postbot that I think people would like to know is that not only is it a tool that writes tests for you, but it's also a tool that answers questions for you. So like, for example, if I'm interested in how do I monitor my tests? It gives me some input from the Postman Learning Center, which gives us more insight on monitoring our API. So it gives us the direct links to documentation. So like one of my favorite things is like, how do I use dynamic variables? And it will not only give me a reference to dynamic variables, but what dynamic variables can I use? It should be able to also give me some interesting output into like what kind of variables are available for me to use as well. So Postbot is really interesting in that front. It is also a tool that is now used to document your APIs as well. So let's say you have a collection, you can actually click on the documentation and you can generate your documentation of your API using Postbot as well. So it should give you an entire documented response of like what your elements of your APIs are and how you can go about documenting it and sharing it as well. So, and then we have a lot of different new suggestions that are upcoming. So we have smart suggestions that are new features that are upcoming. And then with visualizations, we actually had this is a great blog as well. So we actually had somebody use the Spotify API to build out an entire visualization playlist and visualization grid. So this is, you can get really creative with Postbot as well. So I'm going to ask the moderators to share some of those links that I might have added in the chat with our users. These are some blogs that are really interesting to see. I feel like Postbot is pretty new this year, but we have a lot of features that are going to come out that, you know, that not only help you with some of the basic type of testing, such as getting response codes, but also visualization, also schema testing, building dynamic workflows. So for those of you who are you know, especially manual testers, I hope this helps you elevate your testing a little bit more and see how you can build out automation accordingly. And so I know we had a question about where Postbot is available. So currently it should be available for free for all users on the free account. So you guys can go ahead and try it out right now. I think there's a specific limit into how many calls you can do, but you can definitely do, you know, use Postbot to generate quite a lot of tests you know, as the product evolves and grows, where it's going to be part of basic and premium plans as well as enterprise plans as well. So I hope this demo gives a deeper insight into Postbot and how you can use it for testing. And with that, I wanted to kind of guide it back over to Joyce, who is going to show how to go about automating. So
I'm reading the comments here during your demonstration of Postbot. It is a pretty miraculous tool. For those of you who have tried generative AI on other platforms, you know, you kind of need to be testing how you're interacting with it. It's natural language, but you know, like you not having to look up in the documentation how to visualize, like what's the syntax for that? What's the syntax for this test is very luxurious. So try it out. Okay, ready for the automation?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so for the automation, we actually have a different workspace, which is also a public workspace specific to testing. So I'll have our moderators add that into the chat, but this workspace is part of the test examples workspace. So the test examples workspace in Postman, and you can take a look here. So I'm going to let Joyce share her screen and we can go from there.
Okay, so for those of you who have already taken some of these sessions, you'll be very familiar with the test examples in Postman workspace. There's a lot of code that you can copy and paste, a lot of examples where you can learn about stuff that we're working on. I'm going to be working on 5 ways to automate, and I'm going to start this collection and bring it up to the top so we can take a look at it. And once you use, if you're not using Postbot, Postbot is a way to accelerate the way you're writing tests or documentation or flows. It's a way to accelerate your work, but if you never learned how to use Postbot, if Postbot never came into being, you can still do all of this stuff on your own. So once you learn how to write a test, there's a couple tips that I'm going to go through, just quick tips off the top of my head, not ranked in any particular order of importance. But when you're generating tests, something I noticed that Postbot didn't do automatically off the bat, and you probably have to prompt it to because maybe you don't want tests this way, is I've seen really robust tests written where you group multiple assertions within a single test, right? So I could have written separate tests for each of these, but I could have grouped a certain assertion, and this is a poorly named assertion called expect statements are true, but I could come at it with multiple different ways to say that this test is passing in the way that I want it to. So finding all those angles and then grouping them together will build more robust tests. Grouping multiple assertions, that's one. The next one is to use messages for visibility. So in this example, we have the scripting areas, which are under the pre-request script or the tests tab. This is where we're writing JavaScript that can execute either before or after the request. You can use messages to increase the level of visibility, and this will help either in manual testing or automated testing. So when I run this request, I can open up the console and I can see a message statement. This allows me to inspect more deeply values at a certain point in time and execution order. So I think a lot of people don't realize that there is a console. And then secondly, you can also pump messages to the console to help with debugging. The third tip I have, Pooja hinted at this, asking Postbot to create dynamic variables. But this third tip is very good. I've seen where people are using descriptive or dynamic test names. Okay, so in this example here, let me clear my console. In this example here, I am looping through an array, and my test includes a dynamic variable. And in this case, I'm not generating a dynamic variable. I'm actually populating the name of the test. So if I'm looping through different scenarios, if I'm looping through variables, I'll be able to see exactly what test is failing or passing by inserting the dynamic variable into the test name. So when I run that, I'm inspecting the test results, and I can see that the test name now includes dynamic data. So if I was looping through 50 different beverages, I can see that the schema is valid for tea, failed. And so that's a way to isolate what's happening, what's going wrong or not quite expected more quickly. So 3 tips, very quick hits. And of course, Postbot, we already went through a very deep dive into Postbot. Okay, so that's writing tests on its own. And now let's go to the second folder here called Using the Runner, where we'll talk about automation. And Pooja, you didn't have, you kind of had, your collection had root level requests running example after example. You showed how you can set and you showed how you can get, but some people will create very sophisticated flows that pass data from one to another and then create variables that are used throughout the entire collection. So I have 2 examples here, one called linear execution and one called nonlinear execution. In linear and nonlinear just refers to the workflow or the order in which requests run. So under linear execution, I have 3 requests. One is fetching a list of books, creating a new book, and then verifying that the book I created exists. So going through, I can step through, hit each of my requests, and then verify that the request exists. And if I look under what exactly is happening behind the scenes, under the first request, I see a green dot here, which means something is written under tests. Okay, I just have a couple tests there. I'm creating a new book, green dot under pre-request script, green dot under tests. What is happening here? Okay, I'm going to be setting a test, but also setting a variable based on the response that I can now use. Pooja mentioned collection variables are variables that can be used throughout the entire collection. So now I can use a variable called book title that's been extracted from data, returned from the server. And then in the last request, verify the book exists, where I am using that collection variable that I just set in the preceding request, and so on and so forth. And so this is how you do scenario testing. You can replicate what a user is actually doing on your website, how they're consuming your services. This is a scenario. And when I run this, I can either step through, like we just saw, by hitting each request and inspecting the values of those variables and looking at the test results, or I can use the runner. So I'm going to go to the overflow menu and hit run folder. And this loads up the 3 requests that are in my collection, and I can run that collection. So what we see here is in the runner, you can run. In this case, it's in sequential order or a linear execution because this is the way we left the code and the way that the default order is, waterfall order. So that's how I can, okay, look at me. I wrote only passing tests, no failures, but also dig down into the request and the response that was sent. So linear execution, if you've taken an automation workshop before, you're probably familiar with the collection runner. You can either run the entire collection or a folder. Let's take a look at nonlinear execution. Well, what? Okay, so I only have one request. How can this be nonlinear execution? Well, let's take a look. Let's load up our request, and let's close some of these just to clear our screen. Okay, so we have a single request that is retrieving the weather at a certain latitude, longitude. And we have a pre-request script. Again, I'm looking at the green dots to inspect what is the JavaScript that's written under these scripting areas. I've established some information, 3 locations. I'm getting a collection variable. And then here's where I'm looking at my nonlinear execution workflow. I'm using Postman set next request, which is a special method that you can use in the pre-request script or test tab to control the workflow. And so in this case, I'm going to either set the next request to be called in the execution order to be a request called get current weather. Well, that's the same request that we're on. So what we're going to do is loop on the same request until something happens, until we run, well, we'll be in an infinite loop in this case because we're calling itself, until we set next request to null or terminate. So I have some logic programmed under the pre-request script and under the tests tab. And in fact, I have a conditional statement here that will determine the workflow. So somebody had a question about collection level variables. So collection variables, I have my location set to San Francisco here. And if Pooja didn't mention it already, we've covered this in other workshop, but very important difference between initial value and current value. I'm in a public workspace. I do not want to leak my secrets to the entire world by, well, I don't care if people know my location, San Francisco. Initial value is going to be what's shared with your team members and with the public, depending on your workspace visibility. Okay, so this is what our current setup looks like. Now let's run this nonlinear execution folder. And again, it's just one folder. Let's open up our console and clear it for a little bit more visibility into the requests that are being run. Okay, so what's happening here is we're getting the weather for San Francisco, and because of the logic that we programmed, we're actually going to call it again. And if we want to see what's different, change the behavior a bit, we can route. Remember, we looked under the pre-request script. We were routing set next request to this get current weather request, we can actually route the workflow to call any other request within this collection using the name of the request, as we've done here, or the request ID. And so it's very powerful here where we set the conditional. I think our conditional was greater than 60, but if we set a different conditional, if we validate certain criteria, we can then branch to a different folder. We can loop again and again until we check enough, all the items in an array. So it's very powerful, the nonlinear execution using Postman set next request. There's a little bit of a difference. So in the past, you've probably been using pm.object. And so make sure that you're using Postman, a little bit of a nuance there. So once you have nonlinear execution, we use the runner. There's one more use case I want to show you before we jump out of the Postman app to show other types of automation, but that's iterating over a data file. So this is a question that we get a lot where we are testing, right, the response we get back from the server. And we can continue doing that to check our different scenarios. But something that is very powerful is also iterating over an external data file. So if we look at the body in this post request, we are testing an input property naughty value. And the double curly braces is the syntax that we use to access variables defined in text areas. So when we have variables in the request URL or in params or in the body, we'll use double curly braces. And we have this variable called naughty value, which hasn't been defined anywhere yet. We're just using this HTTP bin example request to demonstrate this behavior, but we haven't defined naughty value anywhere. We will be defining it using an external data file. So once again, let's go over to the folder that's holding our single request, iterating over a data file, and run folder, a single request. But now we're going to pair it with, I think I have, let's see what I have. I have a JSON. Okay, let's see what that JSON file looks like. You can either iterate over a CSV or a JSON file. Okay, so our JSON file is actually defined using naughty value property, objects of naughty value property with the values of all of these naughty strings. It's a common list. I think Danny Dainton actually created this file, but problematic strings. If you're using input fields or you're processing calculations, these might be problematic. So somebody has compiled this huge list of naughty strings. This is how I want it to be formatted. We validated it in the preview, and now we can run the collection. And again, it's a single request that's running against every object in that JSON file. And if you look on the far right, you can see how many iterations there are. I don't know how long this list is, but it's pretty long. And if I want to dive into one, if one of these fails, say I was testing this against an input field that I had on an e-commerce website, I could then filter by failed or drill down into a specific request. Here, let's stop the run because I don't know if I'm going to start losing my bandwidth here. But I can drill down into see, okay, which one actually failed if I had a specific run. Okay, so a couple different ways to automate. I think the runner is going to be the foundational way. So first of all, we need to start with tests, right? Then we need to have collections with our tests, creating test suites. And then we need to be able to execute all of the collection in one go, and that's using the runner. And let's talk about a few different ways. Can we skip back to the slides, Pooja? Yeah. I believe I have a slide that talks through a couple different ways.
Let me go ahead and skip back to that slide.
And actually, before you take over.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Let me take over one more time.
Okay.
Because otherwise I'll do this a little bit later. Hopefully you see my screen. Let's go look at the runner again. So before I was going through the overflow menu and was able to open up the runner, there's a couple different places, but just like Postbot, the bottom right is going to be your friend here. So I'm going to open up the runner and I'm going to drag this collection into and I'll be able to reorder and decide which folders I specifically want to run and so forth. So you might have noticed here under the functional tab, this is how we ran the collection. But you can also schedule runs. I just want to show you this interface. We'll talk through the scenarios in which you would do this in a bit. You can schedule the runs to run on Postman Cloud. You can also automate runs via CLI. So if you're familiar with Newman, Postman's open source command line runner, there's also the Postman CLI. So the Postman CLI is how you can run collections from your command line and as part of your CI/CD, but specifically Postman CLI versus Newman. Postman CLI reflects those run results within your interface. I'll show you what that looks like in 1 second. But you can schedule runs to run on Postman Cloud. You can run the collection with your CI/CD pipeline. And right here is performance. So for performance testing, you're able to, okay, Collection Runner was running collections locally from your machine. Performance is also running collections locally from your machine, but from your desktop app. I do have my desktop app open here. So if you tab over to performance using Postman desktop app, you'll be able to have concurrent virtual users and see what that looks like. And we have a test feature here where you might be able to loop through a data file, but that should not be in your instance of Postman right now. So I'm going to go back to Postman in the web, Postman web app. In one tab I want to show you that is relatively new if you haven't seen it before. I'm going to select the collection. And then next to variables, there's a tab here called runs. And I see all the history of the runs that I've been running, all the metadata around it. But it's very helpful when I'm saying, okay, I ran it via CLI, I ran it via runner, and here's the metrics around that. And then drilling down into the health and status so that when something goes wrong during automation, you can hop back to manual testing.
Yeah, this is awesome. Joyce, can you show the different ways to connect like the different services we have for the CLI and how they can go about like setting up like a CI/CD pipeline? I believe we have like Jenkins and a couple others.
Yeah, so we have built-in integrations that are limited by number of integrations depending on the Postman plan that you're on. But also for the Postman CLI, you would install, I'm just talking through it because there's an API key up on my page right now.
No problem.
So it works the same as Newman as with Postman CLI with one caveat. Postman CLI, because we want to display the results to you back in the Postman app, uses your API key to log into Postman. And then you would install either Postman CLI or Newman in your CI environment and then use that package to run your collections. So cool. There's a lot of questions about the difference between Newman and Postman CLI, and we can go into that if people have questions, but so many questions that there's a beautiful graph or a chart in our Learning Center docs. I'll try to find it and drop a link. Can we go back to the slides?
Yep.
And then I think there is a really good graphic at showing when to use what type of automation.
All right.
Yes. So we talked about the collection runner. You can do functional testing, performance testing, or even debugging, just like as you're building out your automation suites, understanding what's happening and then making sure that you're testing what you mean to test. Collection runner is incredibly powerful for local development of your test suites. We also talked about the Postman CLI and Newman. So Postman CLI is closed source, Newman is open source. Both of them allow you to run collections from your command line or as part of your CI/CD. We also have an image, a Docker image that's rather popular. So if you're running containerized apps, containerized tests in containerized apps, you can use the Docker image. And then we have, if you're trying to trigger on-demand testing, right, as integrating it with other platforms, we do have webhooks. So we didn't show you flows. Pooja briefly talked about using Postbot in flows, but flows is our low-code, no-code API workflow builder. If you create a flow, you can trigger it using a webhook. We also have good old-fashioned Postman API webhooks to trigger a collection run. And these collections run on Postman servers. And then the last one, we did see what it looked like in the interface, is scheduling runs to run on Postman servers. So scheduling it as frequently as every 5 minutes to monitor the ongoing health or infrastructure of your APIs. And then the last one, if you have an eagle eye there, there's a live collections. So that is rather new. Live collections where you drop a live agent in your code base, and then based on the usage of your APIs, it'll automatically generate. It's really good for discovery when you don't know what's being hit or you have zombie APIs out there.
Yeah. So just to tell the full story, so Joyce has really dived deeper into the automation side of it. And as the testing story here is, if you're starting off with a collection that has like multiple requests, you can use Postbot to, of course, generate and write your tests. Even at the basic level, use those as a template to build out your tests, write your, create some visualizations if that's interesting to you. And then depending on where you want to test, whether that's using a CI/CD pipeline, or if you want to have some sort of scheduled, triggered situation, you can take a look at some of these means of automation, whether that's testing locally or testing in different environments. So there was somebody that asked a question about working with different variables, whether that's on the collection side globally or on the environment variable side. The interesting thing here is that depending on your tests and the variables that you've set up, you can kind of export and import some of those variables based on the environments and how you decide to kind of set up your test automation. So with that, I feel like we've gone through quite a bit. I wanted to share, we have some tips for writing better tests. Did you want to share any tips?
Yeah, let me go over this really quickly. So if you took a look at the example collection that we were sharing in Test Examples in Postman Public Workspace, you'll see physical examples of this. These are just a few tips. One that's not on here, but that we talked about extensively, is scripting. Scripting really will elevate your Postman test. That is the way that you can create scenarios that are realistic and more robust. One thing I didn't mention is that's brand new is pm.skip test. So this is the way to conditionally skip something from a pre-request script. So a lot of people ask, hey, I don't want to run the entire collection. And the way you would have scripted that before is to, in the preceding request, set next request to manually skip it. Now there's PM skip test, skip test, I believe it's called, that runs from the pre-request script. And not only does it not run the primary test that it's on, it will not run the tests neither. So that's pretty new. So a couple tips here just to keep in mind as you're building out your tests.
Yep, that's awesome. And of course, you can skip tests in the collection runner by, selecting which ones you want to test. This is a great resource, Joyce. Joyce created this Level Up Your Postman Skills resource. So we can drop that in the chat, but essentially, this is for anyone who is an API testing professional. So feel free to take a look at some of these skills that you might have already and experiences that you might have already. You can take a look at how you've kind of gotten, if you've ever tested in these ways. And these are all basically.
This is a self-assessment. Yeah. So if you're like, how good am I really? Where am I on the pyramid? This is a good one to take by yourself, but also with your team. If you have plans in 2024 to do something with your team and move in a certain way, this is a good way to test. This is a good way to test future candidates that you're going to hire onto your team. If you've required them to have Postman experience and they're like, of course I do. This is a really good way to assess. And this was borrowed from Gleb from the Cypress community. So lots of very good resources there. as well.
Definitely. And then we have the 15-day testing challenge. So for those of you who are brand new to testing and are, looking to kind of get some of the skills that we talked about today, this is very similar to our 30 days of Postman, but it's all about testing and for testers. So you can always take a look at the 15-day challenge, and I believe you get a badge at the end as well. So feel free to drop that link into the chat as well for 15 days of Postman testers. I think pretty much it. In terms of what we've covered today, we covered the types of testing that you can do. We've taken a look at Postbot. We've covered the types of automation capabilities, and we've also kind of talked about different collaboration features as well. So some of the resources that we've shared are, 15 days of testers. So I'll have the moderators drop some of the resource links in the chat. I also wanted to share a really great resource, which is Postman API tests for beginners. For any of you who know Valentin Despa, he's a active supernova in the community. He has a great 4-hour workshop on kind of getting started on how to use Postman to write and automate API tests. So definitely be sure to take a look at those resources as well.
And I'll say that the title of that is for beginners, but the only way it takes you up to a pretty advanced level. It just starts with a nice gentle slope. So very, very enjoyable way to learn.
Yeah, definitely. And so I'm just going to drop some links into the chat for those of you who are interested. And then, of course, if you enjoyed our session today, we'd love for you to take our survey and kind of give us some more insight on how you felt that the session was, and anything that you would like to see in any of our future sessions. We always appreciate taking a look at some of the feedback that we receive always. So I'll go ahead and drop that survey in there. And I think we have 2 more minutes left. And there's a couple of questions that I wanted to ask that we have available. So one of the questions is about Postbot not being currently available on enterprise plan, and when we can expect this. My thoughts on that, and I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on that, Joyce, as well, is that I think the team is still trying to figure out the right plans. So currently it is available on the free plan, and it is available for upgrade on the basic and professional. And at some point, it will be available in the enterprise space. Any other thoughts there, Joyce?
Yeah, for the enterprise plan, we usually have a very rigorous rollout plan. So it's just because it's an early feature that it's not available right away.
Yep. And then another question that we had are basically about Postbot supporting REST and SOAP and other protocols. So currently I feel that Postbot it is only supported for the REST APIs. With Postman, we have GraphQL support, gRPC, we have MQTT, WebSockets. So these are some more asynchronous requests that we have. And I think, that's also a future feature that Postbot will support some of these features as well. So, but currently these are available in your REST collections and workspaces. So anything else that you wanted to share, Joyce, before we end for today?
Yeah, did you want to drop a link to the survey for people to take? Oh, there it is.
Yeah,
okay.
I think I dropped that link in the chat. So it should be available there. So but yeah, I would love for everyone to go ahead and take a look at that survey and some of the resources.
There's a number of questions about Postbot. I love all the excitement. Some of you have already tried it out and are already testifying at how great it is. A lot of questions about how I can have access to it, or you can have access to it, and how it actually works behind the scenes. Maybe your team has questions. So I believe Kevin Corbett has dropped a link to a really good forum thread. I think that's the best place to have some of this discussion. And also, as always, if you do have additional questions as follow-ups, the community forum is a great place to ask your questions and also help out. If you know something, give back and try to answer some of the questions to the folks that are that are having questions. And then we create this really rich community of folks that are leveling up everyone's game.
Definitely. So with that, I feel like we've gone through quite a bit today, and this was a great session. I had so much fun hanging out with you, Joyce, always. So thank you so much for joining me, and I hope to see you all at our Intergalactics in 2024. So with that, we'll close off. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the moderators as well for answering a lot of questions.
Thank you.
Thank
All right,
you.
goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Pooja.
Bye, Joyce.